Hi, this is Logan Schlutz with Estate Professionals, and this video is for sellers reviewing an offer on their home in 2026. Okay, so there's a few things in here that the sellers might want to take a look at. Some of these points I will obviously go through and check for you as well, but for anybody who would like to look at it themselves, here's what I would suggest. In section 2.3, the seller's name, make sure this matches what is on the deed. And I will make sure that the legal description in 2.4 matches your street address, the common description, which you can see here in line 3.2. One of the most common problems that we have in contracts is inclusions on the day of closing don't match what the buyers or sellers were expecting. So I would suggest going into the inclusions section here and making sure that everything as seems as it should be. So there's kind of three sets of inclusions here. Item 2.5.1 talks about anything that's attached to the home. So typically attached is going to be like something screwed into the wall, trees that grow back, or plants that grow back on an annual basis. Um, if it's attached to the property, all of the following items are going to be included unless they are specifically written in as an exclusion someplace else in the contract. So it's going to be lighting, heating, plumbing, ventilation, and air conditioning units, TV antennas, inside telephone, network and coaxial cable wiring and connecting blocks, jacks, plants, mirrors, floor coverings, intercom systems, built-in kitchen appliances, sprinkler systems and controls, built-in vacuum systems, including accessories, and garage door openers. I will write the buyer's agent will have written in how many remote controls they expect to be included with the transaction. Make sure this matches how many you have. Um, if checked here, the solar panel, water softener, security systems, satellite systems, if it's checked here, it means you own it. So if it's checked and you don't own it, in other words, you're making payments on it or it's leased, that's a problem. Um, Section 2.5.2 inclusions. These are additional items, so things that are not attached but will be included anyways. This is storm windows, storm doors, window and porch shades, awnings, blinds, screens, window coverings and treatments, curtain rods, drapery rods, fireplace inserts, fireplace screens, fireplace grates, heating stoves, storage sheds, carbon monoxide alarms, smoke, fire detectors, and all keys. Then in section 2.5.3, the buyer's agent will have written in other things that they expect to be included with the home, which might not be attached. For example, we might see clothes washer, clothes dryer, refrigerator, dishwasher, stove, oven, range, microwave. Sometimes they include a microwave and you have one, counter one, but it's not in the wall. If they've written that here, then you need to leave it. So just make sure that in section 2.5.3, anything written in here are things that you are planning to leave with the home, or are at least are okay leaving with the home. All right, section 3 is going to be the dates and deadlines. I'm going to start with item 2 and I'll explain why this section is important. So item 2, alternative earnest money deadline. This is a deadline by which the buyers need to bring the deposit on the home, and we'll see how much the buyer is offering for a deposit in a subsequent slide. Um, the buyer is able to cancel the contract and get their earnest money back under a certain contingencies that set forth in this section. So the buyer has to take action by these deadlines by a certain time of day. The time of day will be written into item 1. For example, it's probably going to be 7 or 8 p.m., or sometimes you'll see 11:59 p.m. Just make sure that this gives you, with your work schedule, enough time to respond to the buyers. So if it's 7 p.m., but you get off of work at 6:30, let me know so we can push that back to 8 or 9 p.m. because sometimes we need to go right up to the deadline. All right. So, generally speaking, the buyer is going to have the opportunity to do their due diligence into title, an HOA if you have one, to review your seller's disclosures. They will have a contingency for their loan and credit deadlines, appraisals, and inspection deadlines. Um, I will go into detail onto how and why the buyers might be able to cancel, but just for the time being, understand that they do have several opportunities in which to cancel the contract. If you see any of these dates and deadlines that are blank, it essentially means that doesn't apply or they're waiving their right to that. Closing dates, check to make sure that you will be available to attend closing on the closing date, and the possession date um, will typically match closing. In other words, in most days on closing, you will need to have all of your things out of the home except for those items listed in inclusions. The property should be clean and ready to hand over to the buyer, and they will typically plan to move into the home after the closing has taken place and the transaction has funded. Um, in some cases, you might be able to retain the ability to stay in the home, usually for up to 60 days after closing, in which case that possession date um, should be the same day that you're expecting to leave the property. I like the contracts to say will or will not in section 3.3.3. For the deadlines, it says if any deadlines fall on the federal or state holiday or on the weekend, Saturday or Sunday, that the deadline will be extended. That is often because we are not able to act on our obligations of the contract on a federal or state holiday or over the weekend. For example, if the closing took place on a Saturday, the closing companies are not open and the banks, like for example, are not open, so you can't send a wire on a Saturday and expect it to fund on a Saturday. Section 4, this is going to have the buyer's offer. So the purchase price that they're offering is going to be in the left side column. On item 2 on the right side, this is going to be the earnest money that they are willing to bring. Section item 3 is their new loan amount. Usually 4, 5, and 6 won't apply. So the cash at closing should be their price less the earnest money less the new loan amount should equal the cash at closing. This is not the total cash that the buyer will need to bring because they will need to add their lender's closing costs if applicable to cash at closing. This is just essentially talking about their down payment, um, money less earnest money. 4.2, don't trip up on this section because this can be a big one. Sometimes the buyers will ask the seller to give them money towards their closing costs. This could be for interest rate buy down, loan discount points, loan origination fees, prepaid items, or any other fee, cost, or charge, expense, or expenditure. So if they're asking you as a seller to pay for part of that, it should go here in section 4.2. So check this to make sure that looks um, to make sure that's in sync with your understanding of the purchase price. Section 4.4.3, I will check to make sure that the buyer has selected does have funds that are immediately verifiable and available in the amount not less than the stated cash at closing. If they say they do not, it typically means that the buyer needs to sell a property in most cases in order to close on your home, even if they have not listed a contingent sale deadline in the contract. Um, Loan limitations, this is where we'll see what type of loan the buyer's getting. So part of my job will be to make sure that the type of loan the buyer is getting is compatible with the type of property that you are selling. Um, in some cases, if the buyer is getting an FHA or VA loan, they will also list in here expenses that they want you as a seller to pay if they are not allowed to pay them by law. The buyer's contingencies, this is kind of a repeat of section 3, but I've put this in a order that makes more sense because this is the way things actually happen. But it's not the order that the contract lists them out. So Typically, we will deliver the seller's property disclosure and a lead-based paint disclosure if your home was built before 1978 to the buyer within 2 to 3 business days of going under contract. It's obviously better to have these done before we go under contract, but if we haven't, this is a deadline. The buyer will have the right to do their title due diligence typically within 5 to 7 business days. Their new loan terms deadline, I'm going to explain what the difference between this and the new loan availability deadline is in the slides to come, but they will have 5 business days for this deadline. If they are asking you as a seller to provide extra due diligence documents, we will do that within 5 business days most commonly. The buyer will do their inspection due diligence within 7 days for the most part, unless they're getting some type of specialty inspection like an asbestos test. If the home was built before 1978 and they want to do a lead-based paint test, that will typically follow the same timeline as their inspection. The appraisal deadline will typically occur in about 15 business days because there's a shortage of appraisers in Colorado. Um, Insurance termination deadline, I wrote here 15 to 16 business days. My preference as a listing agent is to make this a little bit more in sync with the inspection deadlines, but many buyers will ask that this occurs within 15 to 16 days, business days. Finally, after all of these items have been complete, the lender will have all of the information that they need, hopefully, by this point in time to totally approve the buyer with no contingencies on the lender's end. At that point, they can issue a final loan approval to the buyer. This typically occurs in about 18 business days, with closing at about 22 business days, or typically this translates to about 30 calendar days. In most cases, possession will be on the day of closing. So you close, the buyer's funds hit your bank account, and the keys are handed over to the buyer, and they can start moving in. Loan contingencies. So we'll go through the buyer's contingencies one by one. The first one is the new loan terms deadline. This is the buyer's ability to cancel the contract in their sole subjective discretion related to anything essentially affecting their loan. So this can be um, their payments, whether they think they are too high or too low, the interest rate, the conditions or costs of the loan, so their closing costs. If any of these items are unsatisfactory to the buyer, they may cancel the contract. The new loan availability, again, this occurs like basically our final deadline. Typically, when this deadline passes, the buyer's earnest money is hard or non-refundable. And up until this deadline, there are usually opportunities for the buyer to cancel the contract, get their deposit back, and otherwise get out of the contract. So, um, this is essentially if the buyer doesn't have their loan totally approved by this deadline, they can cancel the contract and get their earnest money back. They cannot use this deadline because they decide they don't like their new loan terms. For example, their payments or their closing costs. They can't use this because the appraised value came back low, unless they're getting an FHA or a VA loan. They can't use this because of a requirement listed on the appraisal, and they can't use this because they can't get insurance or they don't like the insurance that's available to them. So this is supposed to be because the buyer has not been totally approved. The next buyer's contingency is the appraisal contingencies. If the buyer is getting a loan, typically there will be an appraisal date in the contract. If the property does not appraise at value, in other words, the value listed in the contract and their offer, then the buyer will have the right to object and ask you as the seller to reduce the purchase price. We have to have a written agreement in that circumstance by the appraisal resolution deadline. If the buyer um, and you as a seller cannot come up with a resolution, in other words, you are unwilling to reduce the purchase price, and the buyer is not willing to bring the difference in cash, so their down payment plus the difference in cash, plus their closing costs, the contract will automatically terminate, and we will be required to refund earnest money to the buyers. If the buyer's getting an FHA or VA loan, essentially the dates and deadlines in the contract don't apply, and the buyer can't lose their earnest money. because of a condition that's listed in an appraisal report or because the purchase price came in at less than value. This does not preclude the buyer, however, from bringing the additional cash necessary to close, should they want to, but it leaves the option up to them. The appraisal condition. So if the appraisal report says the home is worth X, but you or the buyer has to do Z, such as replace the roof, fix chipping paint, replace window screens, whatever it might be, um, by default, the contract will terminate once that has been disclosed to us as a seller. In most cases, we'll try to work something out with the buyer so that the contract can move forward. HOA review. So if you have an HOA, we will be required to provide all of the following to the buyer. So it lists here all association declarations, articles of incorporations, bylaws, articles of organization, operating agreements, rules and regulations, party wall agreements, 7.3.2, any minutes, 7.3.3, list of all association insurance policies, 7.3.4, a list of association assessments, both regular and special, and 7.3.5, these are our financials for the HOA, and 7.3.6, any notice of construction defect suits or actions. Um, Couple options here. You can typically pull these from an online account if you have one. I can certainly help with this. We can also order them from the title company. They usually charge $90 per HOA to pull the documents. We'll provide these to the buyer, and then the buyer has the ability to terminate the contract based on any unsatisfactory provision in HOA documents in the buyer's sole subjective discretion. In the event that we don't provide the documents, the HOA documents to the buyer on time, the buyer has 10 days from the day that they actually receive them to cancel the contract and get their earnest money back. Then the buyer has a title contingency, and the title contingency essentially says that as the seller, we are picking the title insurance company, and a title insurance company on our behalf is going to send a commitment to the buyer to provide title insurance. In that title insurance document, there's going to be two sections. A requirements section, which will indicate anything that we need to do in order for the title insurance company to provide title insurance, and in some cases, anything the buyer needs to do. And they're also going to list off a section called conditions, things that they will not, conditions or exceptions, they sometimes call it, things that they will not cover. These are going to be things like uh, covenants or existing easements that are recorded. The buyer is going to have the right to review the exceptions in the title commitment insurance policy to determine if they feel comfortable moving forward with this purchase or not. Um, We will also need to provide by the same deadline all existing surveys in your possession as a seller, and we must disclose to the buyer all easements and liens or other title matters not shown by public records of which the seller has actual knowledge. Um, The third thing that the buyer is going to get related to title is a tax certificate. And a tax certificate is going to list off what the taxes are currently and what those taxes go to. So if you're in a metro district, it will include that. Um, the buyer will have the right to cancel the contract or to object, in other words, to ask you to participate in resolving a buyer's concern in some way. And they can object related to anything on that uh, from the record title or for the title commitment, anything from the off-record title, the tax certificate, or the deed from the transfer of title. Typically, with the title, everything is pretty good and we don't have too many issues. On the seller's property disclosure, if we haven't already done this, and we will need to provide the buyer a copy of the seller's property disclosure where we indicate any problems that the home may have. Um, Regardless of whether the contract requires us to provide the seller's property disclosure, we need to disclose any adverse material facts to the buyer. If something comes up after we're under contract, so for example, the AC goes out and stops working, we need to disclose that to the buyer using a new seller's property disclosure. From the time that we disclose that to the buyer has 5 days from the receipt of the disclosure or closing, whichever comes sooner, to terminate the contract. Um, the buyer's inspection contingency, so the buyer will have the ability to perform an inspection on the home, and essentially they can cancel the contract based off of the physical condition of the property, including but not limited to the roof, walls, structural integrity of the property, the electrical, plumbing, HVAC, and other mechanical systems, the physical condition of the inclusions and leased items. Three, service to the property, including utilities and communication services, systems and components of the property, for example, heating and plumbing. Four, any proposed or existing transportation project, road, street, or highway. Or five, any other activity, odor, or noise, whether on or off the property. So essentially, based off of any of these items, because of its effect or expected effect, if the buyer views that as unsatisfactory in their sole subjective discretion, they can do one of two things. They can terminate. So they've done the inspection and they just think it's too much work. They can terminate the contract and have their earnest money refunded to them. Alternatively, if they have not um, terminated, and this is an either or, then they may object. And albeit the seller has no obligations to do anything that the buyer asks them to do, unless you've agreed to it in the contract, um, the buyer can ask the seller to make a certain repairs, give credit, like a credit towards their closing costs. In some cases, like maybe prepay a contractor, hold money in escrow after closing. Um, but they can seek some type of resolution which would satisfy them. Before then, the inspection resolution deadline, we have to come up with a written agreement with the buyer in order to uh, allow the contract to move forward. If we don't, then the contract will automatically terminate by the resolution deadline if we haven't come up with one. In some cases, if we say we're not going to do anything, it's possible that the buyer just may withdraw their objection before the resolution deadline. But in either case, if they haven't withdrawn their objection or we haven't signed a resolution, then the contract will terminate and we need to return the earnest money to the buyers. And then we have the insurance contingency. So the insurance contingency, and just read it. The buyer has the right before the property insurance termination deadline, in their sole subjective discretion, to terminate based off of any unsatisfactory provision of the availability, terms, and conditions and premium for property insurance. So, in other words, the buyer can essentially terminate the contract based off of anything related to their insurance. Many buyers would like to have this after the appraisal deadline because the appraisal can sometimes reveal information about a property that wasn't known. For example, the property is in a floodplain. Um, I like to have this a little bit closer to the inspection deadline because it is kind of a blanket contingency, but it's not like the buyer doesn't have lots of other opportunities in the contract to terminate and get their earnest money back. So this is an important one to think about. And then our final major contingency is a due diligence contingency. So if the buyer has asked for due diligence documents, and I'm just going to go to this slide first and come back to the other one. This is our deadline by which we have to provide the buyer the items that they have asked for. So the contract gives us five documents which we are required to give them whether they've asked for it or not. And then there's a section where they can write in anything additional that they would like us to provide. So sorry, if you're looking for the contract references, first point should read 10.6.1.1. Any occupancy agreements if the property is rented or leased in any way and that lease will survive to the day of closing or afterwards, we need to provide copies of those documents. And then 10.6.1.2, if there's any items in the home that are leased, that will be conveyed to the buyer. We need to provide copies of those leases. Encumbered inclusions documents. So if we have anything in the home, like a furnace maybe, that somebody is making payments on, they own it, but they're making payments, so it's encumbered. We need to provide the documentation to the buyers. And then solar power plan, if your home has a solar power plan, then we would need to provide those documents to the buyers. If your home has a septic system, then we need to have your septic tank pumped and inspected, and then we send that report from the professional to the county, and they will issue a septic use permit or a Boulder County Smart Septic permit. And that's a requirement that the seller must pay for and furnish this to the buyer before closing. Section 10.6.1.6. If you don't have any of these items, let me know because we should just eliminate them before we sign the contract. But some th things that buyers might ask for would be previous inspections reports, copies of insurance claims, water tests, water potability tests, if you have a well, utility statements or averages, or any warranties currently in effect. So buyer due diligence deadline will need to provide those documents to the buyers. If the buyers believe that they are unsatisfactory in their sole subjective discretion, they may do one of the following. They may object, and presumably tell us how they would like that objection to be rectified by a resolution deadline, or the buyer may terminate, and in which case we would need to provide release their earnest money and the home would no longer be under contract. All right, and then as we go through the contract, the other major things to look for, Section 13, the special warranty box should be selected in most cases. Uh, Sometimes we see buyers select the general warranty deed. We don't want to necessarily do the general warranty deed because um, the fringe scenario here is we're paying for title insurance for the buyer, but in several years, the title insurance company goes out of business. The buyer makes a title related claim. With a general warranty deed, you are obligated to defend them. And the general warranty deed obligates you to defend them for clouds on their title during the time that you have owned or had owned the home and anybody that came before you. So, special warranty deed limits that essentially to the time that you have owned the home. So you're not taking up the liability for everybody that has owned the home before you for as long as that land has existed. All right, then closing costs. The buyer's obviously going to pay their own lender's closing costs unless agreed otherwise. But Section 15.2, the title company charges you as a seller for two things. One, the title insurance, which we're providing on behalf of the buyer, and two, the title company is helping facilitate the transaction in the sense that they'll be transferring deeds, recording the buyer's new loan, paying off any loans that you may have. And since we're both equally using the services of the title company, we typically will split these fees one half and one half. The cost is typically $400. I use land title, and so $200 to the buyer, $200 to the seller. HOA fees, other fees, non-property taxes. So let's just kind of go through these one by one. Section 15.3 is HOA fees. If you have an HOA, then 15.3.1 says you will pay for a status letter fee. This is a fee that your HOA company will charge to issue a letter to the buyer with basically a summary of the fees that they charge and any fees that are due and payable upon closing. 15.3.2 is a record change fee. This is the fee the HOA charges to set the account up, the HOA account up, and the name of the new buyer. Usually the buyer would pay this, but if you're selling a condo or a townhome in 2026, the market is more of a buyer's market, and they might ask that you pay for this as the seller. Typically, these are a couple to a few $100s. Reserve and working capital fee if your HOA has a reserve or working capital fund and they require that the buyer or seller pays into it. at the time of closing, then this might be applicable. And again, this could be paid by buyer, seller, or half and half. Any other fees that are listed in the status letter fee, again, we will indicate here whether they're paid by the buyer, the seller, or half and half. The local transfer tax rarely applies in our market, so typically you'll see that as NA. And the sales and use tax 15.5 rarely applies in our market unless we're including something of significant value like artwork, car, machinery, in which case um, then we will indicate here who's paying for that. Other less common fees, so private transfer fees, unless you're in Johnstown and like Thompson River Branch or Niwot and the Gold Branch community, typically this will not apply. When it does, it's typically a fee charged by a metro district or an HOA, and they charge a percentage of the home's value at closing, so indicated by the purchase price in the contract, as a fee that's paid to said metro district or HOA. So, for example, in Gold Branch, with those multi-million dollar homes, it's 1% of the purchase price is paid into the HOA's fund. Water transfer fees don't typically apply in our market, so you should typically see this as NA. Utility transfer fees should typically be paid by the buyer, so we would want to see the buyer pays that. For sellers, keep in mind if you are a non if you are considered a foreign person for the purposes of U.S. income taxation, a FERPTA tax could apply to you. So if this does apply, I want to talk to an accountant or at least have an awareness of this expense before you sign off on this offer. And 15.9.2, if you're a non-resident in the state of Colorado, typically the title company will withhold 2% of the purchase price at closing. Um, and sometimes it's possible to get an exemption from this, but you need to talk to a CPA. Tax credits and special assessments. So we will provide the buyer a credit for property taxes at closing. The way this works is because the buyer is not going to own the home for the entire year, but in 2027 they will receive the tax bill for the entire 2026 calendar year. We are going to provide them a prorated credit for the days at which we have owned the property. So typically you'll see the most recent mill levy and most recent assessed or actual valuation per the county assessor box checked here. 16.1.2, if the property is rented, then we'll typically see this accrued box checked here. So just saying we'll essentially prorate the rent to the buyer. So for example, if they close on the 15th and then you were paid rent on the 1st, about half of that rent will be credited back to the buyer because they'll have owned the home for half the month. Um, if you have an HOA, typically we'll see the seller box checked here. And that's essentially saying if any special assessments are put into place before closing, that you as a seller will have the obligation to pay for those special assessments at closing. And then finally, in section 29, because the commissions are not advertised on the MLS any longer, the buyer's agent will have the ability to request what percentage of the purchase price they would like to receive as compensation for bringing an agent. So we'll typically see 29.1 selected, and the buyer's agent will have written in here the percentage commission that they are asking for. And we'd just like to make sure that this is what you are expecting and are comfortable with. And then finally, if you are planning to stay in the property on or after closing, then we are seeking essentially what is called a post-closing occupancy agreement, which can usually extend for a period of up to 60 days. In that case, we want the section 31.1.1 box checked. That means the buyer is submitting their essentially short-term rental agreement as an attachment made part of the contract. This gives us the ability to review that along with their offer as a whole so we can make an educated decision as to whether or not this is an offer that you would like to move forward with. So that's a quick summary of the most important sections of the contract. Please, as always, call me, text me anytime. I'm available Monday through Sunday, 8 to 8, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time and your business, and we'll talk to you soon.